Hello and welcome back to EESC 418A. This is Lecture 9B, Instructions, Manuals, and Standard Operating Procedures. So this lecture covers a few different types of instruction manuals. They're all fairly similar. Essentially, you as an expert or a producer of some information are telling somebody else how to use that information or how to use an instrument or how to carry out a procedure, but basically how to do something. Some of the most common types of procedures and manuals that we'll see in earth and environmental science include standard operating procedures, which are pretty much universally known as SOPs. Operating manuals. This could be for something as large as, say, a wastewater treatment plant, or something as small as an instrument. We have technical guidance documents. Technical guidance documents can cover a very large procedure. For example, an environmental impact assessment might have a technical guidance document that covers the overall assessment, and this is something that would cover dozens of people working over different disciplines over several years. Or we can have something fairly simple, for example, how to analyze the response we get from a well test if we are looking for hydraulic conductivity. We would have a technical guidance document to do that test and then to analyze the data. Software manuals often come as instructions. In particular, if we're using a new piece of software or a complicated piece of software, we'll need some sort of instructions to run it if it's not some common type of software like a Microsoft product or an Adobe product or something like that. Instrument procedures can be really important, especially if we're using a new sophisticated instrument that requires specialized calibration procedures. If we're not following the procedures in our manual, we're likely to get the wrong readings, and our entire field program or laboratory program can be really worthless if we haven't followed the instructions. And then finally, safe work instructions. This is something that applies to people who go out in the field and need to complete field work in isolated or dangerous conditions, and they have very specific instructions written for how to do that safely. Most instruction manuals or standard operating procedures have some fairly common elements. There will usually be a preamble or general information at the start. So this is usually some fairly normal looking text with paragraphs and section headings, just as we would have in another type of technical document. We may have a section on scope or applicability. In other words, what does this apply to? Is it a specific instrument or a specific type of assessment or a specific type of analysis that we might do in the field? There might be warnings, especially if we're using some instrument that has electrical or other types of hazards. If we're going out drilling, there might be warnings to stay away from the drill rig or watch for overheads or something like that. And this would be in a special section specifically to warn us of any hazards. Even though those hazards might be listed again as we go through the instruction manual, these are usually set apart in a special section for our safety. A list of assumptions. Prerequisite knowledge or preparation that we need to do before we start using a specific instrument or technique. A supplies list. We might need a long supplies list in order to use a specific instrument. So for example, we might need calibration standards or glassware to use an instrument in the lab. And then we'll find a long set of step-by-step instructions. And I'm going to focus most of this talk on the step-by-step instructions, because the text that we'll find in the previous sections that I just mentioned will be similar to the other types of technical writing I've mentioned elsewhere. And lastly, we might have a set of resources or references. So see also this document or that document, or refer to a specific document where we got our information. And again, that would be pretty similar to other technical writing. So I'm really going to focus on the step-by-step instructions. So there are some best practices. Step-by-step instructions are actually pretty easy to write if you just remember to keep it simple and don't worry about repetition. We're not going to be using a lot of transitional phrases. We do want to use parallel structure, but we're not trying to make this writing interesting. If we do, it's not going to be very clear. So we use the imperative mood. All of the verbs that you see on this page are in the imperative mood. It's essentially the infinitive verb with the word to removed. So if you think to use, to include, to put, just remove the word to, and now you're using the imperative mood. So in other words, you're giving an order or you're giving directions. So use the imperative mood, don't mix and match, don't use the passive voice. Particularly in a technical manual, we don't want to use the passive voice because then it's not really clear who's doing what. You need to be very clear. If you use the imperative voice, even though you're not mentioning who's doing what, it's very clear that the person reading it is the one who's doing all of the actions. And we don't say please, even though it might seem polite. We just want to keep it short and sweet. We want to keep it as concise as possible and as clear as possible. So it's essentially do this, do that, do this, do that. Include photos and figures wherever you can, especially for something that's new or something that's unusual. If we can demonstrate it or illustrate it in a photo, it makes a lot of difference. If you think of yourself maybe installing something that you would have bought online and you go through this long list of procedures and every once in a while they've thrown in a picture with an arrow pointing at something, it really helps a lot to understand what their instructions really mean. So put yourself in your reader's position. What do they know already? Usually not much if they're reading this procedure in the first place. So don't assume that they know much of anything really. So this means if anything, we're going to err on the side of giving too much instruction. It's pretty easy for somebody to skip a few steps as they're reading if they already know what it means, but it's very difficult for them to fill in those gaps if we leave out information that they need. So write chronologically. Pretty much all of the instructions you will write will be in chronological order. Do this, then do that, then do that, then do that, and finally, do this. Separate your text into different sections. It is much easier to read instructions if you've got 5 or 6 bullets or list items in a row, separated by a heading and possibly separated by a paragraph or 2 of explanatory text. So think like a project manager. Break it down into tasks. Maybe there are phases and tasks that we can categorize our work into. And then each one can have its own headings and possibly some introductory text. Indent sections. If you're using lists, this is a good time to include indentations. And use different list formats. So you can use bullets, numbers, arrows, or other formats that would help your reader think along this chronological or subtask format. And then use sidebars. Sometimes sidebars can be really helpful. So here's a sidebar. A sidebar contains supplemental information and it's written on the side. It also means that readers can skip these if they are fairly familiar with the material at hand. Highlight important text using bold, underline, or draw a box around it, or some other way of identifying really important text. And then finally, ask for peer review. These types of documents are very important to have read by somebody who knows nothing about what you're instructing, because it is the unknown unknowns that you need to deal with. In other words, I don't know what it is my reader doesn't know, and that makes it very difficult for me to fill in the gaps. However, if you have somebody read it who is quite unfamiliar with what you're doing, they'll likely ask a bunch of questions, and that will be a prompt for you to go back and fill in more information. So I've got a couple of examples here. These are examples that I've worked on that I really like. So this is a Snowpack sampling. This was prepared by a gentleman by the name of Ian Halkett, and I was assisting with this. And he did a really nice job of preparing this SOP. This was for sampling snowpack chemistry around oil sands mines. And so as you can see, he's used a lot of photographs on the right. Each photograph is illustrating a different instruction. And on the left, we see some of the text, each one written in the imperative mood. And these instructions have some introductory text with a nice numbered heading. So this was about 20 pages long, but it was broken into sections of approximately half a page with instructions, followed by photos and other information. Another one that I wrote is the Class 3 driver's training, and this is just kind of to illustrate that it doesn't need to be specific to earth and environmental science. A lot of different fields of study will use the same type of format. So this was for a Class 3 driver training checklist, and as you can see, it has a lot of the same elements that we would have in, say, a calibration manual in the laboratory. So it defines the scope, who is this written for, and the purpose. What are the prerequisites? You need to have your air brakes for this. What are the ICBC requirements you'll need? And then we get into the actual instructions. So before leaving the hall, I've written some lists with sublists, verified that we have these things on the apparatus. So it's essentially a list of tools. And again, this is written in the imperative with numbered headings: verify, have, show, remove, complete. This is just very factual instructions telling somebody what to do without worrying about being too polite or wordy. So that's it for instruction manuals. As I've said, they're pretty universal. This is a fairly common format. You've got some upfront matter followed by a very concise list written in the imperative, and this applies to lots of different types of documents. So have a look at these and maybe look at some other manuals. If you have purchased some furniture from IKEA, maybe have a look at those and see if they follow the same format. Okay, see you in the next lecture.